Welcome guys to a very special comparison video. Today we have all 4 generations of the Mazda MX-5, aka Miata. Now everyone knows what the Miata is. It's basically a household term at this point. But what you might not know is the story of how this car came to be. Back in the 1970s, an automotive journalist over at Motor Trend spoke to the head of R&D at Mazda. When asked what kind of car Mazda should make in the future, he responded that the 1950s and 60s classic open-top British sports car was something missing in the modern world. And it just so happens that several years later, he landed a job at Mazda and was given the opportunity to turn his vision into a reality. And thus, the first generation NA Mazda Miata was born in 1989. Now, the one we're driving here is a 1991 model. It still has the same 1.6 liter engine, making 116 horsepower. And the owner, Justin, has done a few key modifications to it, including 10 street basis coilovers and a racing beat front sway bar. Other than that, the mods are pretty much cosmetic. We have a hardtop, a steering wheel, and that's pretty much it. So let's start off by driving this car and see what made the original Mazda such a special car. Now, the ethos of the Miata is all about lightweight, front engine, rear drive, relatively low power, 4-cylinder engine, and that open top experience. Now, obviously with this one, we have a fixed hardtop, so we are missing a crucial part of the Miata experience, but nevertheless, the strength of this car is driving it at 7/10 on a canyon road. I would argue that unless you go really hardcore with the modifications, the Miata is more enjoyable on a canyon road than on a racetrack. Now, with just 116 horsepower and weighing a little over 2,100 pounds, this car is very lightweight, but the power to weight ratio is still a bit lacking. It's not a very accelerative driving experience. But that doesn't change the fact that this little motor loves to rev. It'll happily rev to 7,000. Now, the immediacy of turn-in with that super light front end and this very connected hydraulic steering rack. By the way, this was an option. Most NA Miatas came with no power steering. Gives this car a very energetic and eager personality. It doesn't have the tightest on-center steering feel, but that's okay. This car was never about razor-sharp responses. It does have a little bit of body roll. And just a simple third gear pull. Takes a while. You get to savor the experience, and I think that's what makes the original Miata so special. Nothing comes at you too fast. Gives you time to actually think about what you're doing and plan what you're doing next. Now, this one, of course, is equipped with the 5-speed manual transmission. Amazing shifter for the time. Not that far off from everyone's favorite Honda transmissions. This particular model also has a viscous limited slip differential on the rear axle. It's just so easy to drive. Not the most inspiring sounding 4-cylinder, but it definitely increases in pitch and lets you know when it's reaching its red line. Super fun little car. And of course, this is the only generation Miata that has the pop-up headlights. Such a quintessential part of that original NA Miata appeal. It's cute. It's a cute car from the outside. And a lot of enthusiasts look down on this car because they say it's not a very masculine car, whatever that means, right? But I would argue that if you can reach the limits of a first-generation Miata, only then are you really justified in moving on to more powerful machinery. This car may be small and lightweight and low-powered, but that doesn't mean it can't teach you a few things. Now, the engine in this car, as well as the subsequent generations of Miata, are actually considered front midship because they are mounted just behind the front axle. That gives the car a nearly perfect 50-50 weight distribution in the corners. It does not feel nose heavy. Just super nimble, just super eager to turn. Double wishbones all around for this NA. As you corner, you gain that little bit of additional negative camber that helps the tires just stick to the road. What a fun little car. It's so tossable. Now, for someone like me who is very experienced in driving front-engine rear-wheel drive cars, the NA Miata doesn't offer a whole lot of adjustability per se. You can't rely on the torque of this little 1.6 to pull you forward and give you a little bit of slip angle coming out of corners. You really have to keep this engine on boil and be attacking corners quite aggressively to get the rear end to step out. But I can say for a fact that with a few key modifications, you can make this car into a serious track weapon. I mean, that's why the entire spec Miata racing series exists. Now, unfortunately, in the year 2022, these first-gen Miatas are no longer cheap. At least they're no longer nearly as cheap as they were a few years back. $5,000 would get you a super clean example in 2019, but nowadays, you're looking at closer to $10,000. But what a way to start the day in the original NA Miata that started the legacy of the Mazda MX-5. Let's now hop into the NB and see just how different the first non-pop-up equipped Miata feels. Welcome to the NB generation Mazda Miata. Now, this one is a 2001, which is the facelifted NB2 generation, and it's done almost 250,000 miles. The owner, Tiffany, dailies this car, tracks it, and has done a few key modifications to make it drive the way she wants. It's got feel, coilovers, these gorgeous raised wheels, and an OEM hardtop. Now, obviously, she's customized the interior quite a bit as well, as I will show you guys in the B-roll. But I think this car is just a true testament to what an amazing ownership experience a Miata can be. NA and NB generation Miatas used to be just the perfect entry-level rear-wheel drive sports cars, and this mileage is a real testament to that. I can immediately feel it's a significantly bigger car, as well as heavier. This car actually weighs in at over 2,300 pounds, so at least 200 to 250 pounds heavier than that NA. There's a little bit more space in the interior. It's a bit more refined, but enough talk, let's drive it and see how it performs. Being an NB, this has the 1.8 liter motor, which includes variable valve timing on the intake cam to produce around 140 horsepower. Yeah, immediately it is a more potent engine than that little 1.6 in the NA. Brakes are better as well. Now, this car has a 6-speed transmission, and the gear ratios certainly feel a little tighter and more well-suited to this type of driving. Same snickety-snick feel to the gearbox, but the way this car handles is certainly a notch or two above that NA. I think a lot of that may come down to this feel suspension. Really nice and compliant over the bumps, and very confidence-inspiring through the corners. Now, where I think the NA actually has this beat slightly is the steering. I think that NA steering rack just has a little bit more feel, a little bit more weight. Now, despite the high mileage of this car, I can just tell Tiffany has set this up to be a track car. The way you can attack corners in this car is definitely sharper than that NA. Just goes to show you can customize these cars to be whatever you want. Huge aftermarket support for the Miata, even 30 years on from the original debut of the NA. Now, having said all that, I do feel the extra couple hundred pounds compared to the NA. In the corners, there's just a little bit more inertia. But the way Tiffany has modified it really offsets the weight because the car just does what I want it to do and is honestly a good deal more confidence inspiring than the NA. A little bit of understeer there, but not to worry. The car is so forgiving to drive. You can make little mistakes here and there in your driving style, but the car will forgive you. And you can make those little micro adjustments without being afraid that the car is going to snap on you. That's the beauty of the Mazda Miata. At least the NA and NB both feel similar in that regard. I think the NB, again, is a couple of notches above that NA. With its 1.8 liter motor, it does give you quite a bit more performance, but the chassis is also set up to support that additional power. It feels just a bit more rigid. In the NA, you really get quite a bit of cowl shake or flex. What a joy to drive. Just such a fun little car. And props to Tiffany for modifying this car the way she did. She's really made this thing her own, as you can tell very clearly from these neon cat gauges. And that top gauge there really sums up this car. Happiness overload. So yes, going from the NA to NB Miata, there is a marked improvement in performance, but dare I say this car slightly lacks character compared to the NA. But that is usually the case as time progresses, technology advances, and cars become more capable and useful rather than holding on to that old school feel of driving engagement. So let's see if that holds true with the NC generation Miata. Welcome to Tommy's 2006 NC Miata. This is a pre-facelift version, but Tommy has done quite a few modifications to it for track use. Jumping from the NA to the NB, in terms of interior and build quality, you can equate that to going from like a Motel 6 to a Ramada Inn. It's a noticeable improvement, but ultimately you're still part of a budget experience. But hopping into the NC Miata, this feels like name your favorite 3-star hotel. I mean, it's honestly that big of a difference. Significantly more space in the interior. Everything feels just better built. And the NVH levels in this car are so much lower. And I think you guys will notice that in the audio quality once I start driving. Now, there's quite an extensive list of mods on this car, so let me go through it. 17 by 8-inch spec MX-5 wheels, which are actually made by Rays. 225 section width Falcon RT615K Plus tires, Meister R GT1 suspension, got some basic bolt-ons, Goodwin Racing header, catted mid-pipe, muffler, and factory tune. Another OEM hardtop on this car. So all 3 Miatas we've driven so far have OEM hardtops. This NC has the 2-liter inline-4, which made around 170 horsepower from the factory, but with the bolt-ons that Tommy's put on, it might be making 5 to 10 horsepower more. Weighing in at over 2,400, close to 2,500 pounds. It's a solid 350 to 400 pounds heavier than the NA and 100 to 150 pounds heavier than the NB. So let's see if that affects the way it drives. One corner was all it took to show me that this car is the best handling out of the 3 so far. Everything feels so tight and controlled. The suspension, dare I say, even better than the Feels coilovers in Tiffany's car. The steering is so tight and direct. Yes. Noticeably more power than the NB, but this car puts the power down. Even that stock limited slip diff does a great job at keeping the rear end hooked up. This car is a handling monster. Let's see what it's like in second gear here. It's so planted. Excellent feel through the steering wheel. Whatever Tommy's done to this car has made the slop in the steering wheel basically go away. This is a properly quick car now with this 2-liter engine. Despite the extra weight, that extra displacement means you don't necessarily have to rev this thing all the way out to get good power. I can just drive this car so much more seriously than the other two. Tommy's modified it obviously, but also this NC chassis feels so much stiffer. The rigidity is on another level. As a result, all the inputs that you feed into the car give you more predictable outputs. There's much less slop in the steering, in the brakes, in the drivetrain. Everything just feels nice and tight. Just look at the way it can attack corners in this thing. Just hooks up. It just hooks up. This is an excellent, excellent car at canyon speeds. It is bigger and it feels bigger, but I would say it hides its weight really, really well. Yes, this car is much more capable than the previous generation Miatas, but from where I'm sitting, it's got a little bit less of that cute Miata charm. This car, to me, feels a lot more like an S2000. It's not a car I really enjoy that much just cruising around at 30 to 40%. It's a car that demands to be driven hard to put that smile on your face, unlike the NA and to a lesser extent the NB Miatas, which are actually very enjoyable just cruising around. I already know what you guys are thinking. How does this compare to the S2000? I think I might have to save that for a future video. Let me know if you guys would like to see that comparison. Tommy's NC Miata against a similarly modified S2000. So needless to say, I'm very, very impressed by this NC. Now the interesting question will be, when I hop into a nearly bone stock ND2 Miata, will that feel like it's on another level altogether, or does this NC hold its own? There's only one thing left to do. So if the NC Miata is a 3-star hotel, then this ND2 2019 RF model is the Ritz-Carlton of Miatas. It feels so far ahead any of the other generations in terms of interior comfort, refinement, build quality, technology. I mean, this is a car you can actually drive every day. So what's there left for me to say about the ND2 Miata? I mean, I've driven 3 different examples of this car now. This particular one, owned by my friend Baotuan, I have driven at least 3 or 4 times for various videos. So in order to try and not sound like a broken record, I'm going to focus this review on how it compares to the NA, NB, and most importantly, the NC Miata. But just to get a few things out of the way one last time, this car weighs in the mid to high 2,400 pound range, which is very close to the NC Miata. But if you compare this to the NA Miata, the overall car is shorter, and yet it has a slightly longer wheelbase and is around 2 to 3 inches wider. So it should give it a much more sure-footed feeling in the corners. The car is pretty much stock except for this rewrapped steering wheel, shift knob, aftermarket exhaust, and some Michelin Pilot Sport 4S tires. Now immediately, we've got more power. Even compared to that NC Miata with its 2-liter engine with bolt-ons, this ND2 just feels more potent. And it's mostly at the top end of the rev range. This engine revs the highest out of any Miata. 7,500 RPM redline really rewards you. Whew. Oh my goodness. This car is stock and yet it feels perhaps the most confidence inspiring. Let me think about that for a minute. Compared to that NC, car moves around with this stock suspension. It has the optional Bilstein dampers, but even then, the car rolls quite a bit in the corners. Let's try this 3rd gear pull here. Plenty of torque in the mid-range. I started that acceleration run from around 4,000, the thing has torque and it'll rev. Now the main difference between that modified NC and this stock ND, it's actually not the engine. The way they handle really shows you what a proper set of mods can do to a Miata driving experience. I think this ND2 does a really good job at feeling tight and composed with very little slop in the controls, but Tommy's car just takes it to a totally different level. Most of it is the suspension. The Meister R just feels really well composed and really controlled, whereas this ND2 with the Bilstein dampers it just moves around so much. Not in an unpredictable or unpleasant way, mind you, but still not the level of control that I'd want from a track car, at least. Now, for an OEM setup, it's good, it's adequate, don't get me wrong, but it just so happens that after hopping from Tommy's NC into this stock ND, the differences are actually really apparent. This transmission feels excellent, really, really good for a stock transmission. One of the best on the market today. For pretty much a bone stock car, there's very little to complain about with this ND2. It's on a completely different level to the NA and NB, and much closer to that heavily modified NC. You might be asking, what about the ND1, or the NC2, or the NB1, or the 1.8 liter NA? There are just too many versions of the Miata. I wanted to keep this video simple and just give you guys an overall high-level impression of these 4 generations. And I think these 4 examples do a really good job at that. The fact that Justin's NA is a bit rough around the edges, has quite a bit of cowl shake, has squeaks and rattles, that's representative of 99% of NA Miatas out there. So yes, I could have gone out and found a really well-sorted, refreshed, updated NA, but I think Justin's lightly modified, very honest NA Miata is actually a better representation of that generation. Tiffany's NB, same story for the most part. Some basic modifications that enhance the overall driving experience, but again, high mileage car, representative of the majority of NB Miatas out there. You have to keep in mind, it's an over 20-year-old car. Tommy's NC is a little bit of an outlier because I've never driven an NC, and that car really showed me what that platform is capable of. And it opened my eyes to the possibility that a modified NC might be actually a really good match for an S2000. And last but not least, Baotuan's ND2, almost stock, and yet it is perhaps the easiest of these 4 cars to just hop in and start driving quickly. You can't go wrong with any generation of Miata. My recommendation is to find the best one that you can afford with the lowest mileage and the best maintenance history, and just drive it. All 4 generations have their charm, they have their appeal, and yes, Miata is perhaps always the answer.